Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for listening to New Polity's podcast. We hope to meet you soon at our upcoming conference, Our Kind of People, May 29th through 31st in Steubenville, Ohio. You can register right now at newpolity.com/events. And to prove to you that our conferences are bucket loads of fun, here is a talk from our last conference that we really enjoyed. Andrew Willard Jones, "The future is always worse than you think it's going to be."
A good friend and I started joking about 25 years ago about what we called the axiom. And my good friend Lou is right there in the back. The axiom is simple, and it goes like this: the future is always worse than you think it's going to be. This started out as sarcastic and self-depreciating. It was a joke about how we were becoming middle-aged cranks before our time. Nevertheless, we were capable of amassing a significant amount of evidence in the axiom's defense. To list just a few examples, in P.D. James's 1992 novel, Children of Men, she imagines a future in which, for some unexplained medical reason, no babies have been born worldwide for 20 years. She describes how nuts this makes people, especially women. For example, they start having birthday parties for their dogs and cats, and start thinking of themselves as pet parents, and start putting their pets in strollers, and start talking about how cute each other's pets are. You see the axiom. She needed a mysterious medical disaster in order to make such a scenario believable. It has more or less come true without one. The future is worse than we thought it was going to be. Another example. Back in the 80s, it was a commonplace of the paranoid right to talk about the government inserting microchips in us or tattooing barcodes on us or something like that in order to track us. Similarly, in the novel 1984, when Orwell imagines the government listening in on everyone, he has to imagine them mandating two-way screens in every home. The point is that we imagine that tracking and surveillance would require an immense expenditure of government power, and that people would acquiesce only because of fear of the consequences of not doing so. But what has actually happened? Everyone voluntarily carries around an extremely sophisticated piece of surveillance equipment and voluntarily allows it to moderate our access to information. I'm talking about smartphones, of course, and the craziest part is why we do it. It seems to be just because people like watching insipid videos and wasting time scrolling endlessly, and depressingly, people don't really care about freedom. The future is worse than we thought it would be. Back in the 80s, we used to talk about designer babies. The idea was that in the near future, scientists would be able to manipulate the genes of babies in utero or the genes of the parents' gametes in order to produce the perfect child. Want blue eyes? No problem. Want them to be tall? We can do that. That sort of thing. The 1997 movie Gattaca was based on this premise, but the way in which designer babies are coming in is very different. We produce 20 or 30 embryos in the lab, see which ones have the traits that we like, pick the ones that we want, and kill the rest. The future is worse. Here's a good one. From the 1950s through the 90s, we imagined that in the future we would have flying cars and jetpacks and that sort of thing. Think Back to the Future, Blade Runner, and really any sci-fi movie up through about 2010. The reason is obvious. People liked going places, and these vehicles would make it possible for us to go places faster and easier. But what has really happened? Instead of inventing technology that lets us get around the real world better, we invented the world of the screen, where a crummy, manipulative version of the world flows into our heads without us having to get out of bed. This has resulted in strange phenomena. For example, teenage drinking is way down. Teenage premarital sex and out-of-wedlock births are way down. Teenage car accidents are way down. Everything that was a negative consequence of adventure in the real world is down. The objectives of conservative-leaning social workers everywhere have been achieved. Again, the future is worse. How about this? Hedonism was supposed to lead to free love everywhere. Everyone would be having sex with everyone else. Dystopic novels from We to Brave New World to Love in the Ruins all imagine something like this. But what has really happened when we finally shed sexual inhibition? Pornhub happened. And with it, the fact that people are having less sex now than any time on record. The prudes back in the 1950s were way more sexually active than are the libertines of today. So I think I've proved my point. The axiom isn't just a joke. There is something to it. I think what we are observing is the downward spiral of all technocracies. But the argument I want to advance today is not merely another conservative, cranky rant against the newest thing, or a hippie, Luddite rejection of mechanism as such. Rather, I want to explore the meaning of technocracy as a regime form, as a certain ordering of mankind that includes intrinsically a certain ordering of the world. I'm going to start by describing a non-technocratic mode of being, and then move into the technocratic. Human beings have a rational soul. We think and so work in universals, and in doing so, we construct a world in which we are at home. When a craftsman builds something, let's say a potter who crafts a pot, several important things are happening. First, he is looking into the nature of the clay. What I mean is that he is perceiving something true about what it is. He is perceiving it in act, its form, and so perceiving at least some of the potency that is integral to that form. He sees what it could be. This perception, of course, relies upon his perception of the world in which the clay subsists, because potency is only activated by something already in act, which is to say that in order to see what the clay could be, he has to see what other things are. This is necessary because he must do something to the clay with something that is already there, such as water or his hands or the kiln, and so he has to understand the form of these things, and so their potency. And so everything that interacts with them, and so on. In order to see the clay as a potential pot, he has to have a vision and so a knowledge of a world of relational forms in which pots appear possible and in which they are desirable, in which they belong. It is the craftsman looking at the clay in this manner that renders it a potential pot. His knowing gaze, then, is inseparable from what the clay is. Such knowledge is an art, or in Greek, a techne. The potter knows how to make a pot. He can see the pot in the clay, which is always at the same time a certain vision of the cosmos as a whole. I mention the pot's desirability for a reason. Pots are made for something. The end is integral to what they are. The pot appears in the clay because the craftsman is oriented toward an end towards which the pot's end is conducive. When the craftsman sees a potential pot, he is seeing something that is ordered toward the end of the whole, toward a final end that is shared by all the other forms the craftsman is considering: the water, the kiln, his hands, the table the pot will sit on, the broth it will contain, the person who will dip his bread into it, and who will smile at his friend sitting across the table. This is what I mean by the pot belonging in the world, in which it appears as a possibility. Its desirability is integral to its possibility, and so to what it is. This total notion of the pot to be made is the exemplar, or the idea that the potter holds in his mind as he works on the clay. When the pot comes to be through his work, it comes as an addition to a world that was waiting for it. And in joining that world, it makes it more a place for pots to be. And this world is social, it is shared. The craftsman begins as a child who must learn the many arts that structure his family's world. He must learn how to speak, must learn what things are, must learn why he is there and what others are for. He is shaped as a potter shapes clay by the craftsmanship of his family, which shapes him according to the arts of family life, the art of education, the art of household management, the art of rule, and so on, all of which situate the child in a world of forms and ends from the moment of his conception. As the child internalizes and so becomes a master of the family arts, the child becomes a person who belongs in the family, and the family becomes ever more a place where the child belongs. The process is one of concorporation. The family is itself modified in the direction of the child as the child is modified in the direction of the family. This is what it means for the family to be his home, a place where he is both possible and desirable, a world where he dwells as himself, because it is a world that needs him in order for itself to be complete, to be a whole. When he is apprenticed to a master potter, the child brings all this with him because that is who he is. When he learns how the clay is shaped into the pot, how the pot is brought into the world of forms, it is this world that it is brought into, the world in which he and his family belong. This is important to understand because an art is never, in fact, some generic skill. An art is a deep, abiding understanding of a person in his world, a habitus in the Thomistic sense of a second nature. When the master instructs the apprentice in such a way that he will one day become a master, this instruction must be personal, must be directed at this apprentice, this person, because mastery is nothing other than the integration of the art into the person himself, and so the integration of the person into the world that includes the art, and a modification of the art, and so its world, in the direction of that person. Such education is characterized by a sort of crossing of exemplars. The master sees in the apprentice what he wants him to become. He holds an exemplar in his mind that is an image of himself in the mode of the apprentice. But at the same time, this education can only be efficacious because the apprentice likewise sees in the master a model to emulate. He too holds an exemplar of himself as an image of the master. The master knows himself directly and the apprentice indirectly, partially. The apprentice knows himself directly and the master indirectly, partially. And so the relationship between the two is a profound dynamic of authority and obedience, which creates the shared space of the crossing of their parallel but non-identical ideas, a relationship in which both persons are modified and so concorporated. The shared world that emerges is a realization of neither the master's nor the apprentice's exemplars, exactly, because both of those ideas included intrinsically an image, a supposition of the other person and his world, and such a supposition is always a mixture of the truth of the other and the truth of oneself. The shared world is different from the ideas of both, and yet recognizable by both. It is neither univocal nor equivocal, but analogical. As this shared space grows in completeness, their relationship grows into what the tradition calls friendship. Therefore, when the apprentice masters the art, it has become an art shared between two masters while being the possession of neither. One master recognizes the pot of the other as a pot, even though it is not the pot that he would have made, precisely because he recognizes the art of pottery as including intrinsically the other master and as operating in a world they share, and so a world that neither of them exhaust. This is what it means, I think, for one to recognize the universal behind the particular, the idea that transcends one's exemplars, the non-identical repetition. It is this recognition that is really an openness that allows the master to educate the next apprentice. Every art in a world includes the other arts insofar as they bear upon the matrix of possibility and desirability of that art. So, for example, the carpenter must have a notion of pottery because pots sit on tables of wood, because the person who dips his bread into the broth is sitting in a wooden chair. As a member of a family, the carpenter has learned the art of manners, an art that also includes pots. He has learned the art of doing the dishes, of hospitality, of nursing a sick friend, in all of which pots figure prominently. The carpenter too then learns what pots are, though not as does the potter, not as a ground for his understanding of the table. Rather, the carpenter's understanding of the table grounds his understanding of the pot. He can't make a pot, and he can't teach another how to do it, but he knows one when he sees it, because he knows what tables are, and he knows who he is as a carpenter. Again, then, the identity of the pot is an analogical identity. It is important not to understand me in too limited of a sense here. What I mean is that the full battery of learned arts that constitute a man as the person he is in the world include from within themselves the other arts that constitute this world, as a total world in which he dwells as a whole. Ideas of things are not, therefore, stale, identical repetitions of ideal forms. Rather, when the craftsman forms his idea, he is himself included within it. The exemplar of the pot is at the same time an idea of the world and an idea of himself as at home in it. The pot, then, as it is presented into the world, is social in two very important senses. First, as I've already explained, the art of pottery is social. It has an end that integrates it into a wider social environment. The product of pottery is capable of being evaluated by others because the art of pottery is implicated in all the other arts. Secondly, the craftsman pot images himself, and so his more immediate community into this shared world. When his pot therefore modifies the world, it modifies it by moving it toward being a home for the pot, for the art, for the potter, for the carpenter, for their communities, even as it modifies all these identities and associations in the direction of the wider world. The art, therefore, bridges the gaps between things and persons through the construction of an integral world. We share a world of non-identical repetitions, not only in particulars, but in universals, and this non-identity is the conditions of possibility for the world's dynamism. What I am claiming is that art creates a humane world. Mankind as artists is engaged in a project of elevating the raw material of reality into his world, which is the work of building that world through building himself. Objects emerge then as humane, as integral to who we are and what we are up to. The matrix of potency and act of relational forms that form the world and so underwrite any craft are themselves the product of craft. To state it boldly, we live in a world that is an artifact, though an extremely complex one. This understanding might tempt us down any number of dead ends. We might end up thrown into Heidegger's mysterious clearings, where beings appear without warning, wherein we try to ground the world on itself and get lost in being's circular flow. We might, like Derrida, get caught in our categories and words and our self-referential arts, which appear as inscription, law rather than conversation, and so meaning is always deferred until it vanishes into the groundless difference. Or we might, like Deleuze, try to ground the whole in desire, and so find a world of endless frustration, of desires grounded on desires which are never satisfied. Each of these approaches attempts to describe the whole of the phenomenal world through one of its movements, identity, artifice, or desire. Each attempts to articulate an effect greater than its cause, a whole grounded on a part. The world as social construction then becomes a tragedy. If we want to save the world, and I think we should, we have to make a theological move. We have to begin with an understanding that the raw material of reality is not all that raw after all. St. Thomas, following Augustine and almost all the tradition, asserted that reality is itself a product of art, albeit a divine art. God fashions the world according to exemplars, ideas, each of which include within them every other idea because each and every one of them is God thinking himself in a different mode. The parts of reality are already bound up together as a whole in a matrix of potency and act directed toward a desirable end, which is communion with the divine source. Man is most like God because he is given intellect, which is a special participation in the divine mind. The tradition refers to it as a light, as an illumination, through which reality appears to man as already a world, albeit a wilderness, as a world that is calling out for him to transform it, for his arts, for his naming of the animals, for his subduing and having dominion, as Genesis puts it. Man's movement into this wilderness is not therefore under his own steam, as it were. If it were, we would find ourselves back to Heidegger, Derrida, or Deleuze. Rather, man in his nature is already called into a wilderness that is already integral or whole, and that is waiting to be humanized, a move that he always already sees as both possible and desirable. He is called from above. Man's creation of a world, therefore, is not groundless. The human arts that create the world are each an image of the divine art of creation in a different mode. We find ourselves here at the doctrine of the analogia entis, the analogy of being, the doctrine that will save metaphysics from the postmodernists. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 articulated it this way, quote, "Between creator and creature no similarity can be noted, however great, without an ever greater difference being noted between them," end quote. Man's ideas are images of the divine ideas. There is a real similarity, but that similarity is always offset by an ever greater difference. Man's ideas are finite, God's are infinite. Our arts, then, create a world that has no backstop. It is always a symbol, always something that means something more, Everything we craft, everything that appears to us as this or that, has behind it always more. This more is the wilderness, the world of God's art, not yet elevated into our own, but asking for it. And so we see it, we know it is there, though as that which lies beyond. This more allows for the creativity of the arts. The master potter, called by the divine, comes to somehow perceive beyond all the pots that he has ever seen, comes to paradoxically see the darkness that lies beyond the pots. He is inspired and creates something that has never been seen before, and yet something that still belongs in the world, something that the world was calling for, even though it did not know how to articulate it. The human world is looking for God, daring to move into the ever greater difference, as it is called into it. This truth is what renders our arts beautiful. Beauty is the inexplicable breaking through of the infinite into the finite. Or we might say from the other direction, that it is the seemingly preposterous extension of the arts of man into the art of God. When we say the artist was inspired, we should mean it. Here we can see how all craft, all techne, is perfected in an artistry that is necessarily beautiful. And the development of the arts, and so of the world that they build, is the construction of an ever greater beauty. The true, what a pot is, the good, that the pot is desirable, and the beautiful, that the pot is loved, are therefore convertible. Here, then, is our rationality. It is not found in our sorting of the world into categories that we can then use in logical deductions. A computer does this. Rather, it is found in our undermining of mere categories with universals that always surpass our attempts at systemization. The similarity, categories, always calls forth the ever greater difference, the transcendental, which gives space for the category, the similarity to grow, and to therefore be offset by an even greater difference. This rhythm is what distinguishes the universals of reason from mere notions or mere variables of computation. The rhythm is the heart of it. We can move into the difference only through the similarity, only through our categories. But if we are not to suppose that an effect can exceed its cause, this requires the condescension of that which is beyond down and into that which is present. The shallower world must be deepened with the resources available to it, which is possible exactly because those resources are open through faith to the greater difference. Here we find the necessity of mechanism. For the small child, the space outside the little world of his family is a wilderness. The father condescends into the child's world, analogously formulating the truths of his more complex world into the idiom of the child's, and so efficaciously calls the child out into the wilderness that is, in fact, the world of the father. This is what makes the expansion of the child's world possible, but only through love, through love on one side and faith and courage on the other. The child must trust his father and jump into the pool, must trust his father and pedal faster, must trust his father and get on the school bus. What I want to argue here is that this requires a mechanization or a technologization of the larger, deeper world, a temporary pretending for the sake of the child, as if the ever greater difference is exhausted in the similarity, however great. Let me try and explain. The master lays down laws that the apprentice must follow, must memorize, must practice without understanding. If A, then B, if C, then D, and so on. This is mechanism. The apprentice here takes on the form of a servant who knows not what his master is doing. This is the only way for him to follow the master, because the master is modifying the apprentice's world in a way that doesn't make sense from within its native resources. Otherwise, the apprentice would already have the art. The master's or the father's law, then, is laid down and accepted as if nature itself. The master assumes the position of God, with his ideas forming the now relative wilderness that is calling for the apprentice. This is why the tradition repeatedly asserts that rulership is the most divine of arts, and that the ruler is to the ruled as God is to the universe. The objective of the master, of course, is for the mechanisms, the laws that provide paths for the apprentice out of his world and into his wilderness to fade away as that wilderness becomes his home. The laws, of course, being a tentative bringing forward of the apprentice's smaller world into the greater one. Once that greater world is inhabited, the laws are not just inadequate, but are, in a real sense, wrong. Their rightness, their truth, was spoken into a smaller world that no longer exists. We can see here, of course, the dynamic of the Old and New Testaments. Indeed, a child is not wrong to think that God is a kind old man in the clouds, but a grown man is wrong to think so. A master potter who attempted to follow all the rules that he lays down for an apprentice would be working against his own mastery, against himself. This could only be either a lie or a joke. The same thing occurs in all rulership, though at different levels of scale. The ruler calls his men out into their wilderness, out into places that are not their homes, into practices and relationships that they have not yet internalized into themselves, places that are dangerous because unknown. In this space, the ruler must use mechanism, law, if A then B, if C then D. He must organize his men and his tools in such a manner that his will is univocally transmitted into collective action. There are two movements here. First, the wilderness is often populated with criminals and bandits, with mercenaries and tyrannies, as well as with wild animals and dangerous terrain that must be driven out or subdued. The ruler sees what his men cannot see, and so they must act as an extension of himself. They must be organized in a martial manner. They are, in this narrow regard, interchangeable. The second movement is aimed at the interior of the men venturing out into the wilderness. As the world is extended, they must become the men who make it home. These men may not understand the ends of the ruler, but they trust that the ruler's end is a more complete formulation of their own, and so pursue the proximate ends that are given them in faith. Here we find repetitions of the master-apprentice or father-son relationships. Here, the men are most certainly not interchangeable, even though they are subject to mechanism. It is important not to take me too literally here. I am speaking the language of conquest and war, but wildernesses are everywhere. Wildernesses are what always lie in the ever greater difference, beyond or behind the similarity, however great. Every relationship has a wilderness. Every skill, every enterprise, every individual in the interior of his own soul. The immanent world, the world of human construction, is, as I've already explained, a world of analogical coherence, and so a world permeated everywhere with ever greater difference, with wilderness. And this world is itself situated in creation, is itself surrounded, as it were, with the ever greater difference of the natures of things. This means that integral to the peace of the humane world is always the martial world, the world of rulers and the ruled, the world of expansion, of creativity, of danger, and so of valor. Every piece of the whole, then, is called out into the wilderness from their own positions within the humane world. The humane world has hierarchy, always, but the human hierarchy is itself built in the world of the divine art and of the divine rule, ultimate difference, and so is itself being called out into the depths at every level. The temporal order of artifact makes contact with, and so is pulled into the ever greater difference of the spiritual order at every point. The whole moves, not in a direction it comprehends, not with some quantifiable velocity along a measured trajectory, but rather into what is exactly beyond, into a new dimension, supernature we call it. Each and every person prays, the master prays, the apprentice prays, inviting God into their little worlds and listening to his utterance of truth spoken in their simple idioms, like a father with his child. Grace touches each and every person directly, moving them to rule beyond their ability and to obey beyond their ability. And the obediential response of each person is the deepening of the whole humane world in the direction of the ever greater difference, which is the direction of making the world an ever more perfect and so ever more beautiful image of God. The immanent analogy is itself situated within the transcendent analogy. Analogical nature ordered analogically to supernature. This is what makes the eminent analogical world possible as a whole. It is a mistake to imagine, then, the expansion of the humane world as one of concentric circles, as the pushing out of city walls. Rather, it is more like the expansion of the universe, in which each and every piece is moving out, moving deeper. And so in every piece, there is the dynamic of friendship, of father and son, of master and apprentice, both between men and God. All of this takes mechanism, takes laws, takes procedures, takes if A, then B, and if C, then D. It takes, quote, of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, end quote. But all of it is always aimed at going beyond mechanism, into dwelling, into being at home. The world is constructed as a temple for man to be with each other and with God, and as man goes deeper in, he finds that there is no back wall. He encounters no idol of stone which would abruptly halt his movements, ground the infinite in the finite, and so turn the whole around on itself, rendering reason a ruse and the world a tragedy. Instead, God is always present and always beyond. Man's ideas are always present and yet always pointing beyond, always gesturing into the wilderness. This is what it means to have a spiritual soul, to be rational. In such an order, the future isn't always worse than you think it's going to be. Quite the opposite. It is always greater than you think it's going to be, and so faced with hope. And yet, the axiom seems to hold. The future seems to be always worse than I thought it was going to be. This is so because the axiom is an axiom not for the humane world, but for a technocratic world. A technocratic world moves in the opposite direction from the humane world. As I have already explained, in a humane world, mechanism is necessary for the subduing of and establishing dominion over the ever-present wilderness, for the construction of an ever more unified whole, a world for men to dwell in. This dynamic can be turned around, however. As Nietzsche himself explained, power is always equally the power to give or to take. When mechanism is turned around, when it is built not to expand the humane world but to mine its value, we enter into the realm of the technocratic, which is, in its essence, exploitation. The temptation toward exploitation is present, and so this move is possible at every border between the humane and the wilderness, a border that, as I've explained, is present everywhere. The tradition calls this exploitation sin, which is a turn inwards, which Augustine explains is the construction of a world that rests on human standards rather than divine standards, which is built on the similarity, however great, the human side of the analogy of being, as if it were the ever greater difference, the divine side of the analogy, as if it were the ground. This is the process of dismembering wholes, of transforming them into groupings of interchangeable parts without a prime analogate to unite them intrinsically. Rather, they become united extrinsically as mechanism. Such a move apes the move into the wilderness, in which there is mechanism. And so it works on the humane world, which operates on faith and trust. But it is in actuality the inverse. It is the extension of wilderness, and so of the martial at the expense of the humane. It is the process of the conversion of the humane of peace into war, into separation, which inevitably destroys the peaceful substrate on which the corruption rests. This no doubt seems obscure, but it is really a matter of our everyday experience. Take, for example, a lie. A lie only works because the victim has faith in the liar. The liar can manipulate the victim into obeying his will without understanding how it serves the humane world, precisely because the victim still has trust, as does the child jumping off the playground into his father's arms, because he still views the ruler as integral to his world. Without this substrate of trust, of unity, lies don't work. The lie mines this trust, harvests its value. However, obviously, the use of this mechanism steadily destroys its conditions of possibility. As trust is exploited, as value is scraped out of the humane world, trust is turned into suspicion as a new kind of wilderness returns to what was once subdued. And so the lie must shift to a threat, and the ruler, now mere power, is pushed out of the coherent world of the ruled. The wilderness that returns is no longer the creation of God, calling out through its countless unfathomable interrelated natures for man to creatively extend his dominion into the infinite. It is a finite wilderness, full of categories that interact as a mechanism, that have no mysterious ground of unity behind them, but are experienced as ungrounded power itself. The child in the humane world does not know what his master, what his father is doing at one level, while his faith and love assures him of exactly what his father is doing at a deeper level. In the new wilderness, one no longer trusts that the ends of the mechanism are deeper and more complete instantiations of one's own ends, an analogous expression of one's own understanding. Rather, one is a slave who does not know what his master is doing, full stop. Such a slave seeks to protect his own end, to protect his little integral humane world, his home, over and against the ever-encroaching power, which makes no sense and yet is felt, yet causes pain, or, if treated properly, grants rewards. In other words, instead of being the wilderness of God, the ever greater difference of an analogical whole, man faces the wilderness of if A then B and if C then D, in a pseudo-cosmos rent with equivocation, with separation. Excuse me. Which is a world of hard truths that are not open to being undermined through analogical fulfillment. This is the realm dominated by the human knowledge of good and evil, as the Bible calls it, of a false nature masquerading as a divine nature, of men pretending to be gods, of what we will eventually call ideology. It is a world of univocities and equivocations, of unbridgeable gaps. It is the wilderness of idols, of the work of human hands that are feared as if gods. The mechanism is permanent here, and so men's service becomes slavery, his work becomes labor, and his own power, ordered mysteriously from without, holds him in subjugation. Man is forced to dwell in a truncated humane world, a remnant of humanity, maybe his tribe, his village, his family, that contends against, as St. Paul put it, the principalities, against powers, against the world rulers of this present darkness, against the spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Man's world becomes divided against itself. He dwells as an alien sojourner, as St. Augustine puts it. What I mean is that his home, the place where he dwells, is itself not at home in the world, but is in danger. This is what motivates him to serve the mechanism. But, and this is important, such turning inwards of the mechanism is a form of cannibalism, and it always ultimately fails. One can compel a man into serving as an instrument only by entering into the world in which he dwells, the humane world, wherever it is found. First, that world is lied to. Then, when that stops working, it is threatened. Eventually, it is torn asunder, and the mechanism runs out of fuel because it receives none from above. When the humane world of the family, for example, is finally exhausted, the family is no longer available to motivate men to serve in mechanisms of profit or mechanisms of war. Because of the fall, sin penetrates into human nature itself. Because of this, we must add a layer to our understanding of the dynamic of a humane world. The humane world that is pushing out into God's wilderness is not moving into nature simply. Rather, it is at the same time fighting a counteroffensive against fallen nature. The martial structures that the humane world builds in order to expand are always, therefore, at actual war, and are always tempted to turn inwards, and always, to a certain extent, give in to that temptation. This means both wildernesses, that of God and that of men, coexist. Before the openness of God's wilderness can be found, the closedness of human technocracy must often be driven out. Everywhere, St. Augustine explains, the city of God and the city of man are confused and intermingled. The distinction, then, between a humane world and a technocratic world is not whether or not there is mechanism or whether or not there is technocratic corruption. The distinction is in which direction is the whole moving. Is the humane expanding or is the technocratic? Is wholeness being deepened or is it being torn apart? There is nothing utopian, then, about this understanding of the humane. But, and this is important, there's also nothing dualist about it. It is always the case that the technocratic city of man is parasitic on the humane city of God. It can only expand its war onto ground that has before been subdued, because it cannot discover new truths. It cannot create, only use. It is not rational, but merely mechanical. But, and here is the great irony, the more humane a world is, the more wholeness there is, and so the more potential fuel there is for the technocracy. The bigger and stronger it can grow before it becomes exhausted. The corruption of the best is the worst. Christendom was the ongoing construction of an integral, coherent whole. Christendom united all the human arts, from those governing agriculture and marriage to philosophy to mysticism to stonework to rulership. It united them all into a single, coherent whole of remarkable analogical complexity. The peasant's life, excuse me. The peasant's life was a different mode of being in the same world as was the priest's life, or the monk's life, or the nobleman's life, because all these modes of living in the world referred to were images of a prime analogot that lay beyond them all. A great accomplishment of the medieval centuries was the uniting of differences, of unity within sameness, without sameness. The pagans were not like this. For Aristotle, the slave, the artisan, even the woman inhabited different, necessarily deficient worlds. It was only the aristocrat whose life constituted any kind of whole, and this was a whole that explicitly exploited the fragments of humanity that it held on its peripheries. Fragments such as the slaves, who only resembled men, who were incapable of reason, and so of the fullness of an integrated life in virtue. Christendom, in contrast, unified, combined, merged the countless arts that make up the temporal realm into a single world. This is why the pagans' technology was always rather pitiful, while that which has emerged from the dismembering of Christendom is awe-inspiring. As I have explained, the humane world is a microcosm, an image of the whole that is creation, and so is a whole in its own right. The arts, as I described them previously, create small wholes as integral to a larger whole. The pot is a world in its own right only because it is ordered intrinsically into the wider world, which is itself a whole, including the craftsmen themselves. Christendom had extended the microcosm of man's world deeper and more completely into the cosmic whole, the world of men being built as an ever more intense image of the creation of God. Such wholeness is the prerequisite for dismemberment. Pottery must exist as an art in order for the steps, the skills of the potter, as well as his tools, to be torn from each other, for labor to be divided, for small mechanisms to be built that can be assembled into larger mechanisms that produce what seem to be pots, but they aren't really the pots of pottery, they are forgeries that do not construct the world of intelligibility that makes them possible, but rather disassembles it. It is because pin makers made pins that Adam Smith's example of one man drawing out the wire, another straightening it, a third cutting it, a fourth pointing it, a fifth grinding it to receive the head, and so on for 18 steps can become possible. As this division occurs, the arts are forgotten, and we mistakenly think that the pin makers of old were simply assembling the steps of our machines in a primitive and inefficient manner, when in fact they were doing nothing of the sort. As the machines do more, the scope of possibility collapses because the machines do nothing new. The humane was the fuel for the construction of the mechanism, and this fuel was burned up in the process. As this occurs, wherever the humane lingers, holes remain which can be dismembered, fuel is available, and so expansion of the technocratic is possible. Francis Bacon wrote about torturing nature, about putting her on the rack and tearing her apart in order to learn her secrets. But this nature that Bacon encountered was not the raw nature he supposed it to be. It was the nature that Christendom had unified into a whole, into a body that was available for his tortures, for his dismembering. An historical example might help us understand. One of the great humanizing feats of Christendom was the integration of the warrior class into the world of peace. The chivalric knight cultivated an ethos of service. He ventured out into the wilderness and fought the criminals and mercenaries so that it could be subdued and brought into the peace. His form of warfare then was itself humane. If you doubt this, which you should, consider a form of warfare in which it was even possible that the truce of God could be conceived of, let alone lived. As the Second Lateran Council explained the truce in 1139, quote, "We decree that the truce is to be inviolably observed by all from sunset on Wednesday until sunrise on Monday, and from Advent until the octave of Epiphany, and from Quinquagesima until the octave of Easter." Warfare was integrated into the liturgical calendar. Even on the days that they were allowed to fight, the fighting was governed by an ethos of honor that dramatically reduced its lethality. Taking an enemy ransom was always preferred to killing him. The choosing of champions to fight in the place of armies was frequently done, and the results respected. Christendom even outlawed the, quote, "murderous art of crossbowmen and archers, which is hateful to God, to be employed against Christians," end quote, because such weapons were too deadly and put too much distance between the combatants. And I want to dwell on this point for a moment. It is often assumed that when faced with danger, men either enter into a fight or flight response. While this is true, this is a true description of human instinct when facing, say, a bear or a wolf, it is not true when men face other men. Rather, such conflict has a whole different layer to it. Some psychologists of warfare refer to it as posturing. Posturing is when the conflict is integrated into a symbolic world governed by rules through which relative strength can be measured without killing or seriously hurting each other. We see this in the animal world. Consider, for example, two bucks that are sparring during the rut. They are really contending, but they are not fighting to the death or even to serious injury. Rather, they test each other in such a way that the weaker buck can almost always back out and walk away. The same sort of thing happens with men. I grew up with brothers, and we fought a lot. But we had rules. We could be engaged in a real struggle with immense effort being put forth on both sides. But if one of us hit the other in the face with a closed fist, it was a massive violation of a serious taboo. We fought seriously without even considering punching each other in the face. We fought on a substrate of a humane world. My point is that the conflicts that inevitably erupt because of sin are themselves capable of being humanized. It is possible for the ground of the whole conflict to shift in the direction of a humane world, to be fought on a substrate of a deeper peace. The humane world is not a utopia, it is a movement. Crossbows were outlawed internal to Christendom because they were a technocratic push against this humanization. How could the crossbowman show mercy? How could he give quarter when his opponent had been disarmed or knocked from his horse? The crossbow was designed to inflict as much damage as possible with as little risk as possible. It was designed to remove the humane element in war. It was therefore dishonorable, immoral, and outlawed. It was punching your brother in the face. Now, what I want to assert here is that this humanization of war was the ironic precondition for its modern technologization. In the 14th century, kingdoms started lying to their knights. To fight for the truth and goodness, to fight for justice itself, which is to fight for the whole, was shifted to fighting for one's king. To be a martyr on the battlefield for Christ became to be a martyr on the battlefield for one's kingdom. The mechanisms that once pushed out was turned in. The warrior's intense conviction that war could be meritorious, that war could be right and good, was the basis of the mechanism's power. He was told that the men of his king's rivals were not fellow Christians fighting on a substrate of peace, but were rather heretics and infidels, the sources of all disorder and wickedness, and that threatened that substrate. All the old honor codes then had to be suspended because this was not a fight between brothers, but was a fight to defend the family itself. They were crusades. The wars between Christians in the late Middle Ages became crusades on all sides. These wars culminated in the disastrous wars of religion in the 16th and 17th centuries, which killed millions. This was a period of great transition. The humanized world of the warriors was steadily exploited, depleted, and replaced with technocracy. Religion and honor were used up at the exact same rate that bureaucracy was built, and disciplinary regimes of rewards and punishments were deployed. By the end, only a fool still believed that he was fighting in God's cause. And individual knights, with their heraldry, their reputations for prowess, united in their persons through honor and fealty, were replaced with infantry, dressed in uniforms, wielding identical weapons, and following orders with no notion of what was going on, united through discipline, or worse, through pay. The warrior had become a soldier, an interchangeable, expendable part of a vast mechanism of death that did not give quarter. The old knights had been perfected in virtue, in what was truly human, in integration into an integral world. Any humanity in the new soldier, on the other hand, was a flaw, a defect, that the masters of the mechanism tried to train out of him so that he would become an ever more perfect instrument, a mere part of an extrinsically united machine. And so war began to shift to total war, to the contest to the death between machines. My point is that it is not that technology made us better at waging the types of wars fought by the chivalric knights. It is rather that the technocratic move dehumanized war. We degraded ourselves to waging war in the manner in which technological power is ever more efficacious. War changed because we changed to conform to the mechanism. The power of the technocracy requires the diminution of our humanity. Andrew an important engineer behind the construction of the factory system, writing in 1835, was explicit. He stated, quote, "By the infirmity of human nature, it happens that the more skillful the workman, the more self-willed and intractable he is apt to become, and of course, the less fit a component of a mechanical system. The grand object, therefore, of the modern manufacturer is to, through the union of capital and science, to reduce the task of his workpeople to the exercise of vigilance and dexterity," end quote. The intelligibility of the world was redeployed in such a way that the sources of that intelligibility, the arts, were necessarily destroyed. Our world has gotten more powerful as it has gotten smaller. When I read the work of futurist philosophers such as Oxford's Nick Bostrom, I am struck over and over again by how small and cramped their world is, how tedious and boring, how rudimentary and ignorant, while simultaneously powerful, but powerful like a thunderstorm or an earthquake and not like a man. This de-evolution can be seen clearly in the loss of beauty, of the mark of the expansion of the humane into the ever greater difference of creation. Beauty is replaced with ugliness, which is not the mark of a static world, but the mark of a shrinking humane world. Bostrom's world is an ugly world, and we perceive ugliness when we are still a little better than our creations. This is the basis of the axiom. Technocracy is imperialistic. To return to the war example, the late medieval and early modern driving out of the humane on the battlefield was an instrument of the political classes who were engaged in conflict that remained for some time built on a more humane substrate. The infantryman of the 18th century was ideally a robot, moving as a mechanism to the orders of the officers. But the officers themselves operated on a lingering substrate of humanity. They operated according to rules of honor, which united who they were as persons with who they were as officers. The battlefield was not a senseless orgy of unchecked violence exactly because the officers were still following ethical rules that structured the conflict as it structured their life. There was still an order under the disorder. There was still posturing, still an art to it all, and so a sort of beauty. But the imperialism of the technocratic was at work here. The mechanization of war increased the power that an army could bring to bear. And as the mechanism grew, the honor of the officer became a drag on this power. And so it was slowly driven out, like the skilled craftsman from the factory, in favor of efficiency, in favor of tactics, policies, calculations, in favor of parts assembled into various mechanisms. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the noble officer of the 18th century was already anachronistic. And by the end of the 19th century, his honor was a sort of pageantry that he indulged in among his fellows in their now private lives, but which had little to do with the manner in which war was actually fought. Rather, the newly formed officer training programs taught the science of combat, turning the officer into a professional, another high-functioning and yet predictable cog in the machine. But this wasn't the end of humane conflict. It was the pushing of it further out. Through the 19th century, the ruling class of Europe were members of a small group, really a large extended family, and this class was governed by a code of honor that gave them confidence in each other's good faith. They retained control of the diplomatic corps, and they deployed the machine of war against each other, somewhat like football coaches deploying their teams against each other on the field. The competition was real, but they normally didn't mean to destroy each other, and they could always get together and talk about bringing the grand game to an end and instead having a nice formal dinner. Their little world remained far more humane than the technocratic world of the army or factory over which they ruled. But such a world divided against itself cannot stand. Either the humane drives out the technocratic, which requires a reduction in raw power, or the technocratic drives out the humane, increasing raw power as it decreased that power's scope of action. What happened in the lead up to World War I was victory of the technocratic. Over the course of the late 19th century, the mechanism of war had expanded from battlefield tactics and infantry training to logistics. The railroad made it possible to move millions of men and their supplies, but in order for it to work, meticulous plans, unbelievably complex timetables had to be worked out. The powers of Europe established staff colleges, which were where officers learned how to construct these plans. They worked out multiple scenarios and drew up deployment plans that corresponded. If France did A, then Germany would respond with B. If England did C, Russia would respond with D. The construction of these plans was part of the arms race of the late 19th century through which the elites of Europe played their game of posturing, of testing each other's strength and pushing each other back and forth like two bucks during the rut. It was the nature of these contingency plans, however, that there could only be a finite number of them. But more importantly, they interacted with each other in such a way that human creativity and decision-making, posturing, had to be evacuated. Once a plan was initiated, every rival plan was initiated, and any delay, any pause would destroy the functioning of the mechanism and so mean defeat. The games of brickmanship, the arts of politics and diplomacy still exercised by the elites of Europe within the little humane world of their friendship was therefore driven out. The Tsar could not smirk at his distant cousin as he moved some troops close to the border, suggesting a possible attack, while really communicating through the posturing ritual that some concession on the part of the Kaiser was in order. Rather, any twitch towards mobilization required, by the logic of the machine, that the appropriate counterplan be immediately put into action. The humane substrate on which conflict operated was pushed further out, and the killing of a single man on the fringes of Europe led to 4 years of total war and 22 million dead. And everywhere the old families that ruled Europe, through their shared culture and code of conduct, which still bore the inertia of Christendom, if not much of the substance, was swept away by an extension of bureaucracy, expertise, and mechanism. Once the technocratic is welcomed into the superstructure of the humane world, there is introduced a cleavage, a paradox or contradiction that cannot stand. The city of God cannot use the city of man. Either the humane world sets about driving the technocratic out, or the technocratic continues its conquest of the humane. In which case, the tool becomes the master, slavery expands. This is so because in the humane world, the craftsman images himself in the products of his craft. He is in the things he makes, essentially. He is supposed to be there. This is the very meaning of his art. The world then is rendered more human, more united and integral, more a whole, and so the material world is elevated into the human beyond its nature. In the technocratic dynamic, however, it is the reverse. Wholes are dismembered. Any residue of the worker is a product is a flaw, a defect to be minimized and driven out. This is a divorcing of the human from the product of his work. As an inversion of the humane dynamic, the man is reduced below his nature. He shrinks, and his world shrinks with him. What happens to the worker moves on to the managers and engineers, the presence of whom is necessarily a flaw in the next higher level of mechanism, no less of a flaw than the self-willed intractability of the skilled workmen below them in the factory. And so mechanism is extended, eating up the humane that designed it from above, even as it eats up the humane that fuels it from below. Technocracy is neither rule from above nor from below. It is a regime that subsists within the gaps, the wildernesses between pockets of the humane, and it pushes those gaps out from the inside. This is why the future in a technocratic society is always worse than we think it's going to be. We always anticipate future technology from our current position, our current level of attained humanity, as if the new technology will just come join us here without changing our world. But that isn't what happens. The expansion of technocracy is always at the expense of our humanity and of the world that it has built. Now, what about the future? The technocratic world is being constructed on the ruins of the humane world, and it will expand for as long as there are resources there to exploit, worlds to be dismembered. It will then settle into the conquered territory and run as if nature itself. This is possible only because for as long as humanity exists, the humane world will not be completely destroyed, and human beings, in order to live at all, will always build little outposts of humanity, little worlds in which to dwell. This remnant, the remnant of the lowest level of human culture, a little rump world of the humane, will be the fuel that is continuously exploited but never completely exhausted to keep the technocratic running. It will keep running, but dreams of endless dynamic progress are delusional. Creativity comes from humans, and as the humane is eaten up, it will fade away, and our rulers will become the caretakers of a static mechanism like the priests and god kings of the ancient pagan regimes. This technocratic power will be experienced by the remnant of the humane that fuels it as a vast, powerful, and hostile wilderness outside the walls of their little world, and yet always pressing in, always demanding sacrifices that the humans will not dare to fail to offer, service that they won't dare not provide. Because while they will hate that wilderness, they will simultaneously believe themselves to be completely at its mercy. It will be a wilderness that is experienced as if it is nature, but not the nature created by a transcendent God, the nature of diversity finding unity through its constant gesturing into the ever greater difference, and motivated by the always being realized promise of abundance. It will be rather a nature built by human hands, a finite nature full of self-referential similarities, however great, a nature of limitation, of separation, of scarcity, full of finite and yet terrifying powers who we both fear and beg for rewards. That is to say, it'll be full of gods, full of principalities and powers. This new paganism will be far more powerful than the old paganism because it is being built by burning the fuel of the profoundly humane world of Christendom. Again, the corruption of the best is the worst. Ivan Illich once wrote, No, we do not live in a post-Christian world. We live in an apocalyptic world. This seems right to me. However, if the axiom holds, if the future is always worse than we think it's going to be, well, then I don't know what to say, right? It'll be worse than that. I have been being just a little hyperbolic here in order to prove my point. So I will finish with a bit of hope. As I explained earlier, technocracy is always parasitic on the humane. Humane societies always have technocratic impulses within them, and technocratic societies are always built on a humane world. What this means is victory is always within reach. Humanity can win over our own creations, always. It is all rather simple, actually. As the prophet Isaiah expressed with exasperated sarcasm, "What, shall I fall down before a block of wood?" We will always have the beachhead that we need for the counteroffensive. We will always have some friends. We will always have the church, making the power of God's grace available to us. This is all we need. The potency and the act necessary for this is all we need. It is the potency and the act necessary for the virtue, for the courage necessary to expand the humane world at the expense of the technocratic. Christianity is this counterattack, and Christianity isn't going anywhere. Thank you.